Inside this box is a project that I am quite excited about. A few years ago, I took stock of my equipment and started working on getting my projects to the place where I really wanted them to be. For my recent Vox build, this meant selling my previous build altogether and starting over with a new, what I like to call heirloom quality build, the kind of amp you would never want to get rid of. About a year ago, I took a good look at my Marshall 50 watt build from over 15 years ago. It wasn't sounding very good. It was noisy, and it was plagued with parasitic oscillation at extreme settings, which is how a Marshall should be played. It needed a recap and some serious repair. I outlined all of this in a set of videos that you can find in my Marshall JMP 1987 Recap Rework playlist. One of the crazy ideas I had was to turn my amp into a Park 75. A Park 75 is a rare, side-branded Marshall 50 watt amplifier fitted with KT88 output tubes. Mitchell Colby recently recreated this amp for his renewed Park amplifiers line, and there are some amazing videos of this amp in action. One of the problems with my old 50 watt Marshall build was the power transformer. It seemed underpowered with the 600 volt center tap secondary. I had also adapted its mounting to fit the Mojo Tone JTM45 chassis that I used for the build, and it didn't look good. I figured at the time that a set of KT88s and a new power transformer would cost me around $250, but then I started wondering how much it would cost just to build another one. I added up the part cost, and at the time it would cost me around $800 to build a completely new amp. That's a difference of about $550, which means that if I built a new one and sold the old one for at least $600, then it would be as little as a $200 trade-up. I started putting together my wish list for my dream Marshall amplifier, and that is where this project started. What I want to work toward is a custom reproduction, heirloom quality, Plexi-era Marshall 50 watt amplifier using some of the best components available. This amp should rival Marshall's current PCB-based 1987X amplifier that currently retails for $3,000 US. My amp should come in at under half the cost and with much better components and with more features. So let's talk about the components. There are several styles of aluminum Marshall Plexi-era chassis out there. Some JTM45 based, some 50 watt based for square rocker switches, and some are a hybrid of the two. But there only seemed to be one chassis with the right look, a yellow zinc-coated steel chassis that takes a lay-down power transformer. That is the Valvestorm 50 watt chassis. Valvestorm took over supplying premium Marshall-based do-it-yourself amp components when Metro Amp, short for Metropolis Amplification, stopped selling kits and parts. Many of the components I will be using in this amplifier are supplied by Valvestorm. The downside to the Valvestorm chassis is that it uses the Schurter large diameter impedance switch, which is expensive, but also looks very good. I opted for the chassis with the square IEC cutout for a removable power cable. There seem to be very few appropriately sized Marshall reproduction power transformers on the market today. Many vendors will list them on their website, but most of these are actually Fender Bassman sized transformers. These transformers fit many of the aluminum Marshall-based chassis that I mentioned earlier. I posted a public service announcement shortly after discovering this to make people aware of this issue. Do your homework before you buy and make sure that the mounting positions on the chassis and the mounting bolts on the power transformer you intend to buy have the same spacing. Another thing to watch for is the power transformer voltages. I found primary windings rated from 110 to 125 volts and secondary windings ranging from 600 to 720 volts, and some were not even specified, so you're not even sure what you're going to get. Classic Tone seemed to be one of the few manufacturers making a proper Marshall-sized lay-down power transformer. Their products were highly regarded on do-it-yourself amp forums. I selected their hybrid laydown style transformer, which has secondary windings for both JTM45 and JMP50 circuits. The JMP50 secondary has a middle-of-the-road 625 volt center tapped secondary. I also purchased a Classic Tone Marshall 50 watt output transformer and vintage style choke to complete the transformer set. Sadly, Magnetic Components, the company who produced classic tone transformers, closed their doors during 2020. After getting confirmation of this, I quickly placed an order at Tube Depot, and I believe I have one of the last classic tone Marshall transformer sets. Valvestorm sells pre-made turret boards made from GPO3 red swirl fiberglass. For my previous amplifier build, I made one of these boards myself, and it was sort of a pain. It didn't cut very cleanly, and the fibers would get stuck in my fingers. I really liked the look of the perforated turret boards used in some vintage Marshall amplifiers. I noticed 2 available from different suppliers. Amplified Parts listed a board that had 7 rows of turrets, and Mojo Tone sold a board with 8 rows of turrets. Each had a 3/8 grid spacing. The board mounting holes for the Valvestorm chassis required 8 rows for mounting the board without modifying the chassis, so I bought a red Mojo Tone perforated turret board and enough double turrets to complete the build. For this build, I'll primarily be using carbon composition resistors. I've heard that these resistors are noisy, but I haven't had any problems with them being excessively noisy in previous builds. I like the look of them, and there are some sonic benefits when used in certain positions in the amplifier. I did use some Dale mil-spec type resistors when I needed longer leads to span the entire turret board. The main body of the Dale resistors are also a little smaller, so they'll work well in parallel with the large cathode bypass capacitors. The majority of these resistors I bought from Tube Depot because they're quite a bit cheaper than other suppliers. I did have a problem sourcing the power resistors used for droppers in the power supply from my 3 main suppliers. Finally, for the screen resistors, I'll be using these green 7-watt Wellwin 1K resistors that I picked up from Valvestorm. I think they look much classier than the white cement wire wounds that are often used in this position, even though I already have a stash of them. Like with my Vox AC15 build, I'll be using CTS potentiometers for the main controls on this Marshall build. I'll also be using a CTS 25K potentiometer for the bias adjustment. This will be mounted on the chassis so the bias can be set from the outside of the chassis. I do also have an Alpha Dual 250K audio taper potentiometer that I'll be using for a master volume. For my Vox build, I was lucky enough to find some affordable, new old stock Philips mustard and WEMA film capacitors, but I didn't have much luck finding affordable or available mustard caps this time around. I considered Mojo Tone's Dijon caps, but decided on Synerger's Royal Mustard caps for signal capacitors. These are supposed to be very similar, if not identical, to the Sozo Vintage line of capacitors. At the time of this video, a 22 nanofarad new old stock mustard cap is selling for $8 each. The same value Sozo Vintage cap is $4.25, the Synergy Royal Mustards are $5, and the Mojo Dijon is $1.50. The Mallory 150 caps I used in my previous Marshall build are $1.15. Since the idea of this amp is that it will be my forever amp, I went with the Royal Mustards this time around. The smaller value capacitors are of the silver mica type, and I did buy a tiny axial 470 picofarad metal film cap from Mojo Tone that worked well on my recent Vox build. These just might make an appearance in the Marshall amp, depending on fitment. I'll be using 2 dual 50 microfarad F&T can caps for the main reservoir capacitors, and I'll be using an axial type dual 32 microfarad cap for the preamp sections that mounts directly to the board since there are only 2 cap cutouts in the chassis. For the bias power supply and the bright channel cathode bypass cap, I'll be using some blue BC Components electrolytic caps. The bias caps have a nice blue candy stripe on them. I really like the look of these caps over the Sprague Adams, and they are a little less expensive too. The 8-pin power tube sockets are the Belton type with metal cage retainers. The preamp sockets are also Belton type with tube shields. I did purchase some Plexi-style SPST toggle switches from Valvestorm, but I have really liked using these larger DPDT toggle switches in previous builds. The SPST switches are rated for 3 amps at 250 volts, and the larger DPDT switches are rated for 15 amps at 277 volts. The question is if the larger ones will fit with a laydown style power transformer. This is where 3D modeling of this build will help make these decisions. This is a chassis mount full wave bridge diode pack, overspec'd at 15 amps. This makes up for the shorter turret board that doesn't have space to mount the individual diodes on the board. The diode from the bias power supply was also overspec'd in comparison, with a 3 amp rating instead of the standard 1 amp normally used in this position. As far as wiring goes, I got a ValveStorm wiring kit. I do stock wire in several colors, but it was just easier to get the kit, which includes some bus wire that I didn't have in stock. This may sound a lot like a ValveStorm commercial, and I did buy all these components myself. I bought most of the amp hardware from ValveStorm, small components from Tube Depot, turret board parts and large switches from Mojo Tone, and some specialty parts from Mauser. So far, the total cost of components, not including taxes or shipping, since those things change varied on where you live, is $982.19. This does not include the price of a head cab, because I'm going to be buying one of those at a later date. However, I did notice that many of the amp kits sold online, which are similar, are running about $1,000 right now. That's it for the components for this Marshall JMP 50 watt model 1987 build. In the next video, I'll be going over some of the mechanical and electrical design concepts, including some mods I'll be adding to the amp. Thanks for watching.